Okay, loaf number 1, it's time to add the salt. So this sat in the proofing chamber for about 35 minutes. That's right at the midpoint of the recommended range of 30 to 40 minutes. I'm starting to see some activity here and some development, so we're going to move forward on loaf number 1. So to add the salt, I always pre-measure my salt. When I pre-measure all the ingredients, I put it in a visible spot to make sure you don't forget to add the salt. Happens to so many people, it's just like a mental block. I don't know why. You don't want to forget to add the salt. So I'm adding 6.7 grams of salt, and then I'm adding 17 grams of 80-degree water. 80 degrees is 26.7 degrees Celsius. It's just enough to dissolve that on top of the dough. There it is. And then what the recipe calls for here is just to fold this over on itself. It says that the dough is initially going to break apart, and you see that water floating around the edges. A lot of beginners, when they do this, they think they screwed it up because this dough really looks like it's floating in the salt. So I really try to squeeze it in to really get it to penetrate into the interior of the dough. Until all that water absorbs out of the bottom of the bowl. And now I'm just going to fold this until it comes back into a cohesive ball, which is what he suggests, that it breaks up when you squeeze it through your fingers. Then you do this pulling and folding until it pulls away from the edges and forms into this ball. There it is. That's just like the picture in the book right there, with his fist in the dough. Looks just like that. So again, here's another point in the process where you have the opportunity to keep mixing this by hand and keep developing gluten. Chad Robertson chooses not to do that. He's trying to save some time here. He's going to catch up on the back end apparently. He's just not doing a lot of hands-on work with this dough on the front end. But this is how we follow the recipe. So we're going to see how it works. So now this is back into a cohesive ball. We've added the salt. This sits for 30 minutes before we do the first stretch and fold. Now, this is where there was tremendous confusion among beginners and people who are familiar with the book and the recipe, where the book was ambiguous, or there was an omission about waiting 30 minutes between adding the salt and doing the first stretch and fold. That was later clarified in the New York Times publication version of the recipe, which is now on the Tartine website. But it's still unclear if, when you're talking about the bulk fermentation time, it starts now or at the end of 30 minutes. I believe it starts now, based on all the readings of book 1, book 3, and the New York Times version. This is the beginning. They start the clock for counting bulk fermentation to follow the recipe in the book, which says it should be 3 to 4 hours. It's from immediately after adding the salt. Theoretically, bulk fermentation actually started as soon as you added the leaven, but Chad doesn't count it that way. So just to be consistent with his guidance of the 3 to 4 hours, it's starting now. So we're in bulk fermentation. We wait 30 minutes. We do the first stretch and fold 30 minutes into bulk fermentation, which is a little bit different than the way the book was originally written, but I'm convinced based on these 3 readings of the 3 recipes now that this is correct. Now, the preferred dough temperature in this recipe, it's very specific in the book, is 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25.5 to 27.8 degrees Celsius. I monitor the dough every time I touch it. We're sitting at 82 degrees Fahrenheit right now, which is the top of the range, 27.8 degrees Celsius. So I have the option to whether put this back in my proofing chamber now or leave it on the countertop. When you leave it on the countertop, especially this relatively small mass of dough, because we're making these 1/3 size loaves, it's pretty quickly going to equalize with the room temperature. So I'm going to crack the door open on my proofing chamber to try to keep that right at 82 degrees right now. So this goes back in now for 30 minutes until the first stretch and fold. Loaf number 2, you can see that relaxed in the bowl a little bit. Now we add the salt. So now loaf number 2, where I want to push the envelope a little bit, bend the rules. I need to get a little bit more gluten development than what Chad's getting in loaf number 1. I have an opportunity right here. When I mix the salt, the instructions say mix it until the salt's incorporated. I can interpret that a little bit more liberally, that when the salt is incorporated, because I can't see it, I could keep mixing this a little bit. So let me get this back to the initial state where loaf number 1 is. So there's my cohesive ball that looks like loaf number 1. But if I want to interpret this a little differently to get a little more gluten development, I can keep working this a little bit more. It's becoming more of a cohesive ball. So when it says turn it, look at that. I mean, that's a more cohesive ball than we got on loaf number 1, just with a few more turns. So this is where this is all about interpretation. This is, you know, the white space between the words. When it says fold it into a cohesive ball, this is getting more cohesive. Keep going, gets more cohesive. Now it's actually starting to get a little stickier. So now this is starting to go beyond a cohesive ball, and this is getting a little soft and sticky now. So there we are. So that went about 2 minutes longer than I did on loaf number 1, just to take that opportunity to get a little bit more gluten development before we dive into bulk fermentation. This goes into my proofing chamber for 30 minutes. Again, if I have the option to let it sit on the countertop or go into the proofing chamber, I want to keep my temperature in the target range. This is sitting right at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 26.7 degrees Celsius. That's the range that we want to be in the proofing chamber for 30 minutes until we do the first stretch and fold. Okay, loaf 3, we're going to add the salt. I sprinkle on 6 3/4 grams of fine sea salt. I add in 17 grams of 80-degree water. That's 26.7 degrees Celsius. And now for loaf 3, you could see this already had some shape to it before I added the salt and the water. So we're getting some gluten development just from that initial handling that I did, mixing the leaven in with the flour and water. Now that we add in the salt, we have another opportunity to handle the dough. We have another opportunity to create gluten. And if you're really obsessive about gluten development on the front end of this loaf, you're going to do some real heavy handling here when you add in the salt. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. First, I just have to squeeze this down to get that water mixed in somewhat, because the water wants to sit on the outside of the dough. So I've gotten that water mixed in, and if you really want to continue to mix this at this point for more gluten development, there are 2 common techniques. One is something called the Roubade method, where you basically use a diving arm like this, and you're going to stretch the dough in a bowl. I would use a bigger bowl to do this, and I'm not very good at it, so I'm not going to show that. The other mechanism that I would use, or the other method, is something called slap and fold. This one I am going to show you because it's an interesting way to do more gluten development early on in the process. This is popular in Maurizio Leo's Perfect Loaf website. He uses this in quite a few of his recipes. And Trevor Wilson does this in the Open Crumb Mastery quite a bit. Trevor Wilson's website is called Bread Works, spelled W-E-R-X, the phonetic misspelling of works. Makes it easy to remember. So I'm going to do the slap and fold directly on my granite countertop because it's going to stick to that silicone mat. So the purpose of this is to incorporate the salt and to do more gluten development. This dough feels pretty wet right now. So the way this works is you put this on your counter, and it's just like it's described, slap and fold. Slap it down, fold it over. And I'm grabbing this really at a 90-degree angle over here, slapping it this way, turn it, slap it and turn it. Now this is really aggressive handling of the dough. I mean, some people would see you doing this and say, I would never treat my dough that way. There are certain times when you want to use this. Like if you have a more dry mix, this one's actually pretty wet. But when you have a dry mix and you really need to incorporate ingredients on the front end, this works. But this is really developing the gluten. You can see, look at how high that ball is right there. I mean, this is really building structure. I don't want to overdo this. And then usually if you're working with a larger mass of dough, you can stretch this a little bit more. And on the fold over like this, you're actually adding air to the dough. It's called catching air, which is also part of this method. It's not just the stretching, it's also the aeration. I think I've done enough there. You get the idea. Look how that's standing up right now. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of gluten. We haven't even started the bulk fermentation process here yet with the stretch and folds. That's already looking like a pretty good ball of dough. So that's a technique that you can use. I did it for maybe a minute and a half. Some people will do that for 6 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, depending on what your dough looks like and how your flour feels and what your absorbency of your hydration is, what the hydration rate is, a lot of different factors. But the point is that's a technique for building gluten on the front end of the process if you want to do that. Very effective. Now this goes back in the proofing chamber for a 30-minute rest. In this next section of the video, we'll go through the bulk fermentation process in detail, and I mean real detail. The reason for this is because in all the experiments that I've done over the last 5 months, I looked at the impact of final shaping on open crumb, pre-shaping on open crumb, different proofing times, changing all kinds of variables. The real action happens in bulk fermentation. The way that your dough is set up coming out of bulk fermentation creates the final loaf of bread. What you do in pre-shaping and final shaping does not have as big of an impact as what happens in bulk fermentation. So that's the reason I'm going to show every step of the process here. You can fast forward through it if you want to, but I only include things in my video if I think they're germane to the outcome, and all the steps that are here in this coming section are germane to the outcome, in my opinion. So we've added the salt, the dough is resting for 30 minutes, and we are officially into bulk fermentation. Now this is according to my interpretation and reinterpretations of the Tartine Bread Basic Country Loaf recipe, where Chad Robertson recommends a bulk fermentation time of 3 to 4 hours. We're doing 6 stretch and folds, and there's a 30-minute break after adding the salt before the first stretch and fold. I believe that that bulk fermentation time, the 3 to 4 hours, begins now. So once you've added the salt, so you start with a 30-minute rest at the beginning of bulk fermentation. We'll do the first stretch and fold 30 minutes into bulk fermentation. And as I said, that's my interpretation of a lot of different confusing versions of the recipe, but in my reading of the 3 versions, I believe that is correct. So now that we're into bulk fermentation, let's just recap. What are we trying to accomplish in bulk fermentation? There are basically 3 things. One is we need to let the dough ferment. So we're really letting the yeast and lactic acid bacteria do their thing. The yeast is going to reproduce, eat starches and sugars, and fill the gluten matrix with carbon dioxide. The lactic acid bacteria kind of works in the background, developing flavor. The second thing that's happening is that we are building more gluten structure. So this is essentially through stretching the dough. We're continuing to build that gluten matrix through the stretching and aeration of the dough. That's also assisting the yeast in some ways by moving the yeast around and aerating the dough. So it actually accelerates fermentation by doing a little bit of that handling through the stretching. And then the third thing that we're doing now is building structure. So in addition to building the gluten matrix by stretching the dough, we're also building the 3-dimensional gluten matrix by folding the dough. So the folds really build the height of the loaf. So when you think about the 3 things that are happening, it's aeration, it's more gluten matrix development, and it's creating the structure of the loaf. Now, as the baker, what you're doing in bulk fermentation is you're assisting the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria to help with that fermentation process, and you're also building the gluten matrix and building the structure. The way that we do that is through a series of stretch and folds. So let me talk about a few different examples. Now there are different techniques for handling the dough in bulk fermentation. The stretch and fold method is one of the most popular, and that was really popularized by Chad Robertson in the Tartine Bread book. What happens with the stretch and fold method, and I'll contrast different methods using this map, is with stretch and fold, you're taking your dough, you stretch one side of it out to the right, you fold that over towards the center, you turn the bowl 90 degrees, you stretch the second flap to the right, you fold that over, you turn it 90 degrees, you stretch it to the right again, you fold that over, and you turn it to the right, stretch and fold. So you get basically 4 layers. I like to try to count the layers here. This is a theme that you'll hear now through bulk fermentation. We essentially created 4 layers, and that's my gluten matrix. But then you also look at these edges that I've created by folding the dough over, and that's what creates really structural integrity of the loaf. That's what's going to build the height of the loaf. And with stretch and folds, you get kind of a floppy structure here. Now let's contrast this with the second method, which is coil folding. In coil folding, you do a little bit different method, which is less about stretching and more about folding. So it's a gentler way to handle the dough. So with coil folding, you lift the front third, you fold it under, you turn the dough 180 degrees, you lift the front, which used to be the back, and fold that under. That creates your first coil. If you looked at this down this side, you've created a tube, or a coil. That's where it gets the name. But I'm only half done, because the coil fold does this twice. So then I turn it 90 degrees, I lift and fold my front third under, I turn it 180 degrees, I lift and fold my front third under. So I've created a second coil now. This really should be called a double coil fold because you're creating 2 coils. Now, when I look at what I've created here, if I were to unfold this, I've created 8 layers in the dough compared to the stretch and fold where we created 4 layers. So you get more layers created through each coil fold. And you can also see this is a tighter package. So in terms of just the structural integrity of the loaf, each one of these bends around the edges creates tensile strength that holds the loaf together. It creates the architecture of the dough. So the coil folding gives you a tighter package. So this begs the question, if you get 4 layers with stretch and fold and 8 layers with coil fold, is 2 stretch and folds the same as 1 coil fold? Not exactly. It's just a different technique. The stretch and fold is more about stretching and a little bit less about folding, and the coil folding is less about stretching and more about folding. It's just a different emphasis. And then, just to add one bit of complexity, when you do the stretch and fold on a small mass of dough, and this is going to happen today because we're doing these 1/3 portions of the standard 1,000-gram recipe, we're working with a smaller mass of dough. So when you do the stretch and folds, you start to get compounding of the folds and the layers in there. So let me show you what happens because this is very important. So with a small mass of dough, when I stretch the dough to the right and I fold it over, I don't have a lot of room to work, so I'm folding typically the whole mass of dough in half. Then I turn it 90 degrees, I try to stretch it to the right, and I fold it again. Now I'm folding the whole thing over again. Look what I'm doing here, I'm doubling. Then I turn it 90 degrees. I can't really stretch it because the dough's tightening up. I fold the whole thing over again. I turn it 90 degrees. I try to get a stretch. It's incredibly tight now. You'll see this with the dough. I fold it over. Now look at this package. This is stretch and fold on a small mass of dough. This creates 15 layers in the dough and creates this incredibly tight package. So this is an important distinction to note, is that people talk about stretch and folds, coil folds, lamination, all these different handling methods. Even with stretching and folding, which is the most simple, the most basic method of handling, it can work completely differently and have a totally different impact on the dough depending on how big the mass of dough is. When I have a big 1,000 grams of flour weight, I can pull those big flaps out and fold them over and create one layer at a time. When I'm working with 333 grams or 250 grams, I can't get that stretch, and you get this compounding effect when you do stretch and fold. So what's the big deal? What's the point? The point is, if I do 4 stretch and folds where I'm creating 15 layers at a time, I create 60 layers in the dough. I create an incredibly dense crumb by doing that. If I create 4 stretch and folds with loose, large mass of dough where I'm creating 4 layers at a time, I get a very loose, open crumb by doing that. So you have to be aware of how many layers you're creating with each fold, and it's impossible to count the actual number of layers exactly. I'm using this as a relative comparison, if you want to think of it that way, or the theoretical number of layers that's added through each one of these methods, because it's significant and it's different when you choose one method versus another. And once you realize that difference in the stretch and fold technique, it explains one of the ambiguities in the Tartine book recipe, where when Chad Robertson talks about how to do the stretch and folds, he says to turn the bowl 3 or 4 times. And a lot of people looked at that and they said, well, what is it? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 3.5? Is it 3 sometimes? Is it 4 the other times? It's 3 or 4 times depending on how much the dough is tightening up. If the dough is incredibly loose and floppy, you want to do 4 turns. If the dough is tight or you're working on a small mass of dough, as I mentioned, by the time I do that 3rd turn, I've created 7 layers in the dough. That's a lot. I might want to just stop if my dough is really tight and I'm working on a small mass. If I make that decision to do the 4th fold instead of 3 folds, I go from having 7 layers right now to having 15 layers. I just added 8 incremental layers through that one last action. That's the equivalent of adding an extra coil fold. It's the equivalent of adding 2 additional stretch and folds, getting the 4-turn version. So you have to be very aware of how much density you're creating in your dough based on the number of folds that you're doing. And then just when it seemed like we have everything figured out, I'm going to add one more dimension to the equation, and that's something I call an upside down coil fold. Now, when most people do a coil fold, they'll take their dough out of the round mixing bowl and they put it into a flat or square rectangular casserole dish like this, because this facilitates the coil folding method, which you'll see when I demonstrate that. But I'm dirtying extra dishes here. I'm moving the dough around. It's possible to do a coil fold in a round bowl like this right in the middle of when you're doing stretch and folds. And it's something I call the upside down coil fold, which I'll demonstrate when we get into that step. But basically what you do is, instead of lifting the dough and folding it under in the classic coil fold, I just lift the dough and I fold it 1/3 towards me. You can do this in a bowl. I lift the back side and fold that 1/3 over. I lift the right side and fold that 1/3 over. And I lift the left side and fold that 1/3 over. This is a coil fold. It's the exact same thing as a coil fold, it's just upside down. When you do the coil fold in the flat casserole dish, it ends up nice and neat because you have the top on the top. This would be the top of the dough essentially. If you do it in your bowl where you're doing it in the middle of stretch and folds, you just have the bottom flap which potentially opens up, but I don't think that makes a material difference. You get the same number of layers, you get the same structural integrity around the edges. So I'm going to do a couple upside down coil folds just to demonstrate that technique. I like that technique in the middle of doing stretch and folds occasionally. So I've included this chart just to summarize each one of the techniques, plus the number of folds that we do and the resulting number of layers, using the counting technique where I subtract 1 from the total number of layers to determine the incremental new layers created. I'm just including this here for reference. And then also at the bottom, I've included the lamination technique, which is not used in this video, but many people are familiar with that, so I've included that here as well. So we added the salt 30 minutes ago. We're ready to start stretching and folding. Now I'm using the timing as I'm interpreting it, where the 3 to 4 hour target bulk fermentation starts when we added the salt 30 minutes ago. So we're 30 minutes into bulk fermentation using that timing. I'm going to try to keep all these stretch and folding operations on 30-minute increments, and I'm going to call these rounds. Round 1, we'll do all the stretch and folds across all 3 loaves, and we'll continue repeating that. If I need to deviate from that timing along the way, I will let you know. So we're ready for loaf 1, round 1, stretch and fold. This is our tartine loaf by the book. Basically reach down to the bottom, lift the dough up. I try to bring it up as far as it'll go on the first stretch. That's a pretty good stretch, but I can feel this dough is really not developed. It's just barely mixed because we didn't do a lot of pre-mixing. And now this is something that's a little bit unique about this process that I'm doing. I'm not following the exact recipe because I'm not mixing 1,000 grams of flour. I've downsized this to do 333 grams, 1/3 of the recipe. So I don't have the mass of dough sitting in the bottom of this bowl. So when I do the stretch and folds, the dough is going to want to come up out of the bowl. This is a little bit like if you're walking on the moon in 1/6 the Earth gravity, you have to have weighted boots to stay down. Occasionally, I'm going to need to use my left hand to hold this dough down really to get the stretch. I'll come back to this because this actually impacts the way that I'm doing the stretching and folding. But on this first round, I'm just trying to get a stretch. I can barely pull. This is what I call the taffy pulling method. I can barely stretch that. This dough is really tight. But that's 4 times around on loaf number 1. I'm going to put this back into my proofing chamber. Let's take a quick temperature check to see where we are. We're at exactly 82 degrees. That's 27.8 degrees Celsius. That's the top end of the recommended range for bulk fermentation. I'm going to keep this in my proofing chamber. If I start to go over the top end of the range, I leave it on the countertop, and that's how I moderate the proofing temperature. Loaf number 2, this is our slightly modified tartine loaf where I did a little bit more gluten development in the initial Fermentolyse mix and when I added salt. So I added a few more minutes of mixing. Let's see how this dough feels. Now this dough is much more supple coming up out of the bowl, getting much more stretch. So you can see when I talk about gluten development, you just saw it right there compared to the first loaf where we didn't really do gluten development prior to the first stretch and fold. That's gluten right there. I mean, I'm exaggerating this a little bit just for effect, but I'm trying to demonstrate what a few minutes of hand mixing did with this loaf. It significantly improved the gluten development on the front end. Stretch and fold number 1 for loaf number 2, back in the oven. Loaf number 3, this is where we went outside of the recommendation of the recipe. We did a 3.5-hour Autolyse. I did a couple minutes of hand mixing when I added in the starter. And then I did a very aggressive slap and fold for 1.5 to 2 minutes. So this, I can see just looking at the dough, this is kind of domed up in the bowl. You can tell that this has more development just by looking at it. Let's see what our stretch looks like. Similar to loaf number 2. I mean, just incredible stretch coming out of that bowl. And again, I'm doing this fairly aggressively on this first round, more just to show the impact of that early gluten development. You can see it right there. Then it tightens up pretty tightly on fold 3 like the other ones. I'm not going to force that on a 4th fold. So on round 1 here, I didn't follow really a strict folding number of counts of the folds. I'm going to start counting these going forward. I really wanted to show and demonstrate the impact of the early gluten development, which is clearly evident. And to demonstrate that impact, here's a comparison of the first stretch from each of the 3 loaves. You can see on loaves 2 and 3, I got a much higher stretch than on loaf number 1 because the dough is more extensible. In loaf number 2, the dough started to tear when I got to the top of that stretch. And in loaf number 3, I probably could have pulled a little higher if I was really testing the limits of loaf number 3. Back into the oven.